Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Eddie Cleofe. I'm a second year PhD student in the Archaeology IDP at the Coates Institute. So would like to start today off with a land acknowledgement. So the Coates Institute at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tobangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hunukvetam ancestors, Ahihirom elders, and Iyohinkem relations, past, present, and emerging. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Chris Rodney. Chris Rodning is professor in the Department of Anthropology at Tulane University. He graduated with an AB in anthropology from Harvard University and his PhD in anthropology from UNC Chapel Hill. He was briefly a visiting assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma before moving to New Orleans and Tulane. His archaeological interests include culture contact and colonialism, cultural landscapes, ritual and religion, and the history and culture of native peoples of Eastern North America. His book, Cherokee Towns and Center Places, Archaeological Perspectives on Native American Architecture and Landscape in the Southern Appalachians, was published by the University of Alabama Press in 2015. He's also co-editor with Rob Beck and David Moore of Fort San Juan and The Limits of Empire, Colonialism and Household Practice at the Berry Site, published by the University Press of Florida in 2016. He's the author and co-author of papers in American Anthropology, American Antiquity, Historical Archaeology, Southeastern Archaeology, North American Archaeologist, and the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, and in edited volumes published by Routledge and Bergen and by the University Presses of Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Rodning is also the current secretary of the Southeastern Archaeological Conference, the current editor of the SSAA Archaeological Record, and the founding series editor of the series Archaeology of the American South, New Directions and Perspectives by the University of Alabama Press. So everyone, please join me in digitally welcoming Dr. Chris Rodney.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you all for attending today. And I'm pleased to be zooming in to the Kotsin for this talk from my home in New Orleans, in the historic homeland of the Chitimacha Indians and other Native American groups who live nearby. A Muskogean term for the area where New Orleans is now located is Bulbancha, which in Muskogean language refers to a place where there are people of many languages, which is a very accurate characterization of this territory prior to European colonization, and actually I think is quite a good fit for New Orleans today as well. I'm pleased to be here with you today to talk about the archaeology of encounters and entanglements among indigenous people and Iberian colonists in southeastern North America, with particular focus on Western North Carolina and the archaeology of the indigenous town of Joara and the Spanish colonial outpost of Fort San Juan and the associated Spanish colonial town of Cuenca, located at an archaeological site in Western North Carolina known as the Berry Site, so named for the landowners. But the historic name of that place was Joara, and then the Spaniards that I'll talk about today built Fort San Juan and an associated Spanish town of Cuenca, which was there from 1566 to 1568. And the research that my colleagues and collaborators and students and I have been involved in for the past 20 years has focused on the nature of interactions between the indigenous host community and the Spanish colonial community that was present in this part of Western North Carolina for that period. Again, principally 1566 to 1568. Before going any further, though, I do also want to acknowledge several people who have contributed to what I'll talk about here today, including my collaborators and project co-directors, Rob Beck, seen there in the lower left, and David Moore, also in the lower left with the straw hat, and that's me right beside David. Rachel Briggs is a former student of ours who's now a project co-director, having completed her PhD and become an adjunct faculty member at UNC Chapel Hill. Another collaborator, shown in the picture there at the bottom with the drone hovering in the blue sky above him is Jason from Harvard, who's been involved in advising us and working with us on geospatial analysis and remote sensing and aerial imagery. So I do want to acknowledge them. Also, our consultants who have been involved in technical analyses of many of our finds at the Berry site. Some of their findings I'll mention during the course of the talk today. And those individuals include Tom Hargrove, Gerald Schrodel, Gail Fritz, Lee Newsom, Liz Horton, Heather Lapham, Steve Davis, and Tim Horsley. I'd also like to acknowledge the hundreds of colleagues, students, volunteers, visitors, and local supporters who have taken an interest in and contributed to our project. The Berry family, for whom the site is named, in recognition of their stewardship of the site and their kindness towards us. And I'd also like to acknowledge the members of the Catawba Indian Nation of South Carolina, who have been supporters and participants in our project. And the Catawba Indian community based currently in South Carolina is an important descendant community with historic ties to the people who lived at the Berry site during the periods that I'll talk about here today, among other sites in other areas of North Carolina as well. The main theme I would like to focus on here today is the architecture of contact and the ways in which identity was manifested in the built environment of a place that included an indigenous town and a Spanish colony, and the ways in which this architecture was a form of communication of a sort among the diverse groups present there. Here we go. My story today begins and then ends at the Berry site, located along the headwaters of the Catawba River in western North Carolina. There's archaeological evidence for settlement at this site and nearby, spanning hundreds and probably thousands of years. Although the major period of interest here in terms of occupation at the site is AD 1400 through 1600. The Spanish colonial outpost that I'll focus on dates from 1566 to 1568, although there was an earlier Spanish entrada that visited the site in 1540. And documentary evidence hints that the indigenous town was still present here in the early 17th century AD, the early 1600s AD. Moravian settlers and English colonists arrived in the mid to late 18th century, mid to late 1700s, at which point there were no longer any large Native American towns here. People had moved elsewhere for a variety of reasons. By the late 1600s, many people from the upper reaches of the Catawba River Valley had coalesced at Catawba villages located near the modern border of North and South Carolina, where the contemporary Catawba Indian Nation is centered today in the year 2021. What I'd like to do is to give you a brief overview of what we have found at the site. And then I'd like to zoom out and consider the history of Spanish exploration and colonization of southeastern United States, a colonial province known to 16th century Spaniards as La Florida, encompassing all of what we think of as the modern American South here in the United States. And then I'll come back to the Berry site and talk more specifically about what we have learned from the archaeology that adds to what we know from historic sources about the nature of interactions between the people of Joara and the Iberian colonists associated with Fort San Juan and the town of Cuenca. What you're looking at are, first in the upper left, a photograph of the Berry site with remnants of a filled-in moat that surrounded a fort, Fort San Juan, as well as the local landscape setting of the site itself. In the background is an artist's reconstruction of what the settlement may have looked like during that period in 1566 to 1568, when the Spaniards were living there. And in the lower left is an image from National Geographic magazine depicting interactions between Native American community members and chiefs and Spanish conquistadors, specifically from the Hernando de Soto expedition from 1539 to 1543. That kind of interaction among Spanish soldiers and Native American community leaders took place at the bury site, took place in the settings that are illustrated in that artist's reconstruction there on the right. And in the background. And what I'll talk a bit about today is the archaeological evidence that supports the interpretive illustration that you're looking at here. Fort San Juan and Cuenca and the Native American town of Joara are located in the interior portion of the southeast United States. Not long before the fort and the associated colonial town of Cuenca were established there, Spanish colonists had established important towns at St. Augustine, Florida, and Santa Elena in coastal South Carolina. One of the tasks that was given to a Spanish conquistador named Juan Pardo in 1566 to 1568 was to establish a series of settlements along an overland path connecting Santa Elena in coastal South Carolina, an important Spanish colonial town in the mid 16th century AD, to Spanish silver mines near Zacatecas, Mexico, which is a long way away. And the sense of the geographic scale of North America was not well understood by Spanish colonists at the time. But the rationale for establishing Fort San Juan in what appears to be, in this depiction, sort of out of the way of that pathway from Santa Elena to Zacatecas, it was an important part of the story of Fort San Juan. The bury site, back to the bury site, is located along the eastern edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Not really in the mountains so much as very close to the edge of those mountains, which are visible from the location of the bury site itself. The map in the upper left shows the location of the site in between two streams that become an important tributary of the Catawba River itself. Notice the Blue Ridge Mountains up here. This oblique aerial photograph shows some of our canopy tents and excavations underway at the site here, which for many years was a traditional agricultural field. Currently in this part of North Carolina, a major economic enterprise and industry is tree farming. And you'll notice over here on the left, rows of trees that are part of such an operation. In the upper right here, you'll see an aerial view of the bury site. A stream known as Upper Creek flows right here along that tree line. And then these polygons depict areas of excavation. Here's the moat around the fort. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but this black line represents a large earthen mound. Native Americans across the southeast United States built large earthen mounds as markers for the centers of the most important towns in any particular region. And often residences of chiefs and or temples were constructed on top of those earthen mounds. And such a mound was present at the bury site and was recorded as such by the Smithsonian Institution in the late 1800s, in the late 19th century. But anyway, this gives you a sense of the site and a little bit about where we have been excavating. And then in terms of what have we found lately, we've been excavating at the site in the current iteration of this project since 2001. We skipped 2020 because of the pandemic, but we've done a fair bit of excavation at this site. And in the middle here is a schematic map showing excavation areas in gray, the location of what we think represents the intact footprint of the mound, which has largely been plowed down. There's not much of the mound visible on the ground surface, but underneath deposits that have been disturbed by plowing, we can recognize basket loads of mound fill, which are typical of Native American mound building associated with Mississippian cultural sites across the southeastern United States. And each one of these differently shaped and differently colored shapes here in this image in the upper left represents a basket load of mound fill placed here to build this mound. Proton magnetometer surveys, and then coring to take out cylinders of soil, and as well as some shovel testing, enabled us years ago to identify the likely locations of burned buildings. Buildings made out of earth and wood that, when burned down and then covered over with earth, look something like what you see in some of these other images. And we have excavated portions of several of these buildings, most of which represent the Spanish colonial town of Cuenca, and an area of the site where we think Native Americans built houses to house Spanish soldiers who were stationed at the fort and at this town. There are written accounts, and I'll come back to those in a little bit, describing that kind of activity. And we interpret these as Native American style structures that housed Spanish soldiers who were stationed at Fort San Juan and the town of Cuenca. Another feature of this map is the fort itself, and this red shape here shows a ditch or moat, and an aerial view of that moat is right here with an excavation and an open excavation trench right here. Depending on how close you're looking and how clear it is on your screen, that's also one of our excavation trenches that was backfilled. We did, by the way, we dug this excavation trench because it fit right along our excavation grid, as you might be able to see. But the ditch itself runs this way, and we realized that it would be much better to have a cross section of the ditch perpendicular to the ditch itself, hence this excavation trench. In any case, this, and I'll say more about it later on, but this is the moat which we think was filled in after the fort was abandoned. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this in more detail later on too, but let me point this out. Right here is another building, and the edge of the basin or depression that was dug to build the structure itself is right here. Importantly, this structure, structure 6, post-dates the filling of the moat around the fort. That's really important point, because it indicates that this structure was built after the moat was filled in, rather than the other way around. And I'll come back to some of those points in a little while. One other feature of the, point I want to make about this image here, though, is that in our last field season in 2019, we were very excited to uncover remnants of 2 more structures. This one over here, structure 9, may not have been burned down, but this one was, structure 10, a small section of which you see here. Based on some of the artifacts we have found there, and this is somewhat speculative, but based on some of the artifacts we have found here, we are entertaining the conclusion and the argument that these buildings, like structure 6, may post-date the fort itself. That's clear for structure 6. It's not definitive for structures 9 and 10, but it's possible. And again, we think that structures 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, shown in the upper portion of this map and this display here, we think that those represent houses occupied by Spanish soldiers during the period of the Spanish colonial garrison at Fort San Juan. That's a little bit about what we have found at the site, just to give you a sense of what it looks like and what's there. Let me, though, then shift to some background about Spanish explorations of La Florida, of what we now call the American South, including the expeditions most directly relevant to studying the archaeology of the Berry site and interactions among the people of Joara and Spanish soldiers stationed at Fort San Juan and Cuenca. Various lines on the map show maritime and overland voyages by Spanish conquistadors in North America during the 16th century AD. And let me emphasize two of them. One, the route of the expedition led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado from Mexico up through what is now Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, probably as far north and east as as Kansas. During the period 1540 to 1542, and archaeologists working in the southwestern United States have identified sites associated with the Coronado expedition, as well as Native American settlements and pueblos that can be dated to that period. In the southeast part of the United States, the main point I want to make here on this map is that the Hernando de Soto expedition, 1539 to 1543, approximately the same time as the Coronado expedition, originated in Cuba after, by the way, after Hernando de Soto's participation in the Pizarro expeditions in Peru. He became an important aristocrat in Cuba and then launched an expedition to travel across much of La Florida, landing at Tampa, traversing Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, traversing the upper Catawba River Valley, perhaps visiting the Berry site. That's not definitive, but he was at least close by, and then onward from there. Let me also note, before I move on, that the Hernando de Soto expedition dates 1539 to 1543, and it was the year 1540 that he traversed South and North Carolina. One human generation later, in 1566, the Juan Pardo expeditions set out inland from Santa Elena, South Carolina, and visited many of the same places that Hernando de Soto had visited 26 years before, one human generation before. The Hernando de Soto expedition traversed the provinces of many different Mississippian chiefdoms, Native American chiefdoms. Archaeologists refer to this cultural tradition in the southeastern United States as Mississippian. And let me emphasize in particular the chiefdoms of Coffee-to-Checky in South Carolina and Coosa in Georgia, about which much has been written by historians and archaeologists. And in between the provinces of Coffee-to-Checky and Coosa, Hernando de Soto in 1540 traversed the province of Joara, and the written accounts of the Soto expedition spell it Xuala. And at the time, Coffee-to-Checky and Coosa were very powerful and prosperous chiefdoms, and Joara was recognized as a desirable place and a productive landscape. But the indigenous community there was not as populous or as powerful as its neighbors in the provinces of Coffee-to-Checky and Coosa. That relationship had changed 26 years later when Juan Pardo arrived, at which time the chiefdom of Joara, or as it was known to the Pardo expeditions, members of the Pardo expeditions as Joara, had become the most powerful and prosperous chiefdom in the greater southern Appalachians. Now, in 1565, Spanish colonial activity in La Florida was motivated largely by the perceived threat of French claims and French colonial hegemony in what we now call the American South, eventually known to the Spaniards as La Florida. But there were French settlements in what is close to what are now Jacksonville, South Carolina, and on modern Parris Island, South Carolina. And those French settlements were displaced by Spanish colonists in 1564 and 1565. Fort Caroline and Charles Fort were French outposts that were replaced by settlements that became St. Augustine, Florida, in the vicinity of the earlier French Fort Caroline, and Santa Elena, South Carolina, which displaced the French settlement of and fort known as Charles Fort in coastal South Carolina. The threat of French claims to the American South drove much of the activity of the Spanish colonial activity in La Florida in the decade of the 1560s. And in part to establish Spanish claims to La Florida, the King and Queen of Spain dispatched a major expedition, one section of which, led by Captain Juan Pardo, who came from a rural community in Spain known as Cuenca in the vicinity of Seville, Spain. One company of this larger expedition landed at Santa Elena in 1566. And Santa Elena had been established the preceding year, but it was in bad shape. And some of the soldiers had mutinied and had left, and in fact had tried to sail back across the Atlantic to Spain, which didn't work out. But Santa Elena itself was not in good shape when Juan Pardo and 250 men arrived. They set out to build a fort to establish the presence of Captain Juan Pardo in the landscape and to shore up the Spanish colonial presence in Port Royal Sound, which was deemed a very desirable natural harbor along the southern Atlantic coast. But there was not enough food at Santa Elena to support Juan Pardo and his 250 men. And there were other challenges that the Spaniards had in maintaining this settlement. Hence, the admiral of the Spanish colonial fleet of the West Indies, Pedro Menendez de Avilés, an aspiring governor of La Florida, dispatched Juan Pardo on expeditions into the interior, in part to establish a series of settlements connecting Santa Elena with Zacatecas, Mexico, also in part to place Spanish colonists in the vicinity of Native American towns in the interior, where, as Hernando de Soto had learned 26 years before, large amounts of food could be found. Juan Pardo was also supposed to spread Christianity to the native peoples of the interior. And it's not recorded explicitly, but there's some hint that there was some rivalry and uncertainty about the political status of different members of the Spanish colonial aristocracy. And sending Pardo into the interior may have been a strategy to minimize some of those tensions. In any case, 6 months or so after Juan Pardo and his 250 men arrived at Santa Elena, Juan Pardo marched inland with 125 of his men. And they had just reestablished and rebuilt the colonial town of Santa Elena on the coast. They had built a fort which included a moat surrounding a space that included a casa fuerte, or stronghouse, for the storage of ammunition and other important supplies. There were several wells for access to water inside the fort. There were bastions on the corner of this fort. And the residential quarters for the soldiers stationed here were outside the fort in the town of Santa Elena itself. And the footprint of this iteration of the fort at Santa Elena has been studied by archaeologists, and there's some similarities between this fort and the one we have found at the Berry site in Western North Carolina. In December of 1566, Juan Pardo set out from Santa Elena and Fort San Felipe on Port Royal Sound in the vicinity of Beaufort, South Carolina, and Parris Island, South Carolina, down here near the Atlantic Ocean label on this map. And he followed Native American trails, as Hernando de Soto had done before him. He followed Native American trails to visit many Native American towns, many of which had been visited by Hernando de Soto 26 years before. At various towns, Juan Pardo gave diplomatic talks to gatherings of Native American community leaders, in which he asked the chiefs of those Native American communities to build houses for him and his men, and to set aside stores of food, which meant principally maize. Maize agriculture and the cultivation of beans and squash, as well as cultivating other crops and hunting and gathering, generated large amounts of food for Native American towns, and Spanish entradas and Spanish conquistadors and soldiers depended in large part on some of those stores of food. Within about 3 weeks of marching inland on foot, Juan Pardo and his company of 125 men, half of his force, 125 men, reached the Native American town of Joara, which was described as being located at the edge of the mountains and located in very productive and favorable land for settlement, very productive farmland and favorable settings for permanent settlement. Pardo could see snow on the mountains near Joara. This was December, and he chose not to march further into the mountains. And he established his principal settlement in the interior in December 1566 and January 1567 at Joara. He established a fort and named it Fort San Juan, and established a colonial town of Cuenca, named after his hometown near Seville, Spain. We have been very excited to find many clues at the Berry site that lead us to identify this as the location of the Native American town of Joara and the location of Fort San Juan and the Spanish colonial town of Cuenca, associated with the Pardo expeditions, which may have been visited by Hernando de Soto 26 years before. He was at least nearby. Juan Pardo established that settlement there at the edge of the Appalachians as part of a strategy to build several settlements along a route connecting Santa Elena with silver mines near Zacatecas, Mexico. Silver produced in Zacatecas was shipped across the Gulf of Mexico and across the Caribbean, where it was vulnerable to piracy. And it was thought that transporting silver from Zacatecas to Santa Elena and shipping it across the Atlantic back to Spain would have been safer. Hence that attempt by Pardo, among others, to establish this overland path. Ultimately, 2 expeditions between 1566 and 1568, led by Juan Pardo, established 6 colonial towns and forts. The main town and fort at the settlement of Joara. And from the written accounts, it would seem that a favorable alliance was formed between the leadership of Joara and Juan Pardo. He asked for houses to be built for him and his men, and he gave gifts, including metal knives and axes and other items, to the chiefs of Joara. In early 1568, within 18 months of the early arrival of Juan Pardo in the interior, news reached Santa Elena that Native American warriors had attacked all of Pardo's forts, including Fort San Juan, and all of the forts had been destroyed and were abandoned. That uprising, or that coordinated effort to erase the Spanish colonial presence in the interior may have originated principally at Olamico, a town in the province of Chiaja in eastern Tennessee, but it very quickly spread throughout the territory you're looking at here. And it would seem that the attacks on these forts were part of a coordinated effort to erase the Spanish colonial presence at what was then the northern borderlands of the Spanish colonial province of La Florida. Which then brings us back to the town of Joara and the archaeology at the Berry site itself, which is located near the headwaters of the Catawba River in western North Carolina, which ultimately flows through South Carolina. In South Carolina, it's known as the Wateree River, which is the territory of the chieftain of Kofi de Checkie, known from accounts of the Soto expedition. Written accounts from the Pardo expeditions describe Joara as situated in a land between two rivers, which might be a reference to these two major tributary streams that meet near the Berry site itself and then flow to the Catawba River. There's a very large floodplain. It's one of the first expansive floodplains after these streams flow down out of the mountains. And today, it's a very productive agricultural area and probably was so in the past. Archaeological surveys by my colleague and co-director and friend Rob Beck at the University of Michigan determined that the Berry site is the largest site among several located in this drainage. Others of which you see here, and it is thought that we think that the Berry site represents the major town, the capital, the political center of a regional polity that included the settlements and communities associated with these other dots on the map and some others as well. Not only is Berry the largest site in terms of the physical footprint on the landscape, but it's the only site in this drainage with a large earthen mound, which was documented by the Smithsonian Institution in the late 1800s as having been 15 feet tall. That earthen mound is no longer easily visible on the landscape itself. In the early to mid 20th century, it was plowed down because it was hard for people to plow the fields with the mound present. But there remains an intact remnant of that mound buried under the field that you see here. And my friend and colleague David Moore first identified parts of that mound remnant in excavations back in 1986. And in more recent field seasons, we have excavated there and uncovered traces of that mound that we're continuing to study in our ongoing investigations. Based on the distribution of artifacts on the ground surface, we can draw the boundary, if you will, of the Berry site where that white line in this image is. Although there are other sites in the floodplain that you'll notice here that are probably associated with the Native American occupation of this part of the Upper Catawba Valley when Spanish conquistadors arrived in the mid-16th century. On the ground surface and buried deposits at the site, we find Native American artifacts like the local style of Native American pottery, which is shown here. This is Burke complicated stamped, so named Burke complicated stamped pottery on the left and Burke incised pottery on the right. Here are chipstone arrowheads from the site, many of which are found on the surface, but also found in intact buried deposits. Many of the raw materials for many of these particular projectile points are local, can be found in stream beds locally. The ones that are the darkest black or darkest gray are probably, well, they are chert, which most likely comes, almost certainly comes from chert sources in eastern Tennessee, perhaps even from the province of Chiaja or nearby, which I had mentioned earlier. We also, of course, find mid-16th century Spanish artifacts, both on the ground surface and in intact deposits that we have excavated, including lead shot, wrought iron nails, Spanish pottery like olive jar, which is sort of like an all-purpose utilitarian container form of pottery. A huge amount of wine and olives and olive oil and food was shipped to the New World from Spain in olive jars, with hundreds and thousands of olive jars in the cargo of ships. And then those containers were utilized for transporting goods inland, and that kind of activity brought them to the bury site. We've also found some glass beads, as well as fragments of copper alloy artifacts, including, not shown here, but we have found some copper bell fragments, and as well as very tightly wound cylinders, like the one labeled here in aglet, which is a lacing tip associated with mid-16th century Spanish clothing. The rolled brass cone that you see in the upper left is probably a Native American ornament fashioned out of scrap pieces of copper alloy acquired from Spanish colonists. And then you'll also notice that flattened piece of lead shot. Back to some of the archaeology of the bury site, we find both Native American and 16th century Spanish artifacts in undisturbed contexts, like the deposits associated with burned buildings at the site. Imagine a ground surface in which a depression is dug and then wood and earth utilized to build a structure that in many cases then was burned down and covered over with earth. And the remnants of those kinds of structures are what you're looking at here. And we have excavated with shovels and then screening the plow disturbed deposits we call the plow zone in search of artifacts. We have exposed the intact remnants of many structures and then conducted excavations into those intact deposits, representing materials from the roof, from the walls, materials present on the floor, and then in some cases, surfaces and deposits from underneath the floors. Suffice to say that although there is evidence for an early, like a 15th century or early 16th century Native American occupation here, not a very dense occupation. And so the Spanish presence here seems to be one of the earliest dense occupations in this part of the site, at least. Other contexts at this site, including the Spanish compound where soldiers lived, are shown here. The light green or grayish blobs here are various pit features, like the ones you see on the right, which were probably dug as a source of clay for architectural material, maybe pits that were then used for mixing clay, and then were then filled in with trash. And so we find a lot of Native American artifacts. Interestingly, plant remains from these kinds of contexts indicate that a lot of corn, beans, and squash, typical Native American foods, were not only consumed in this setting, but were in fact prepared in this setting, presumably by Native American women who would have been the traditional cooks in Native American communities across much of the Southeast. Here is another view of this part of the site with typical Native American buildings, which nonetheless shows some signs of Spanish colonial presence and even influence. Our specialist in wood analysis, Lee Newsom, has identified cut marks on wooden elements from these structures that she thinks represents, and we are convinced collectively represent, surfaces that show cutting and shaping with metal tools, which would have been brought to the bury site by Spanish colonists. The wooden element there labeled plank seems to have been shaped by a metal tool. With less certainty, but intriguing nonetheless, a hole in that timber in the upper left might represent a hole left by a metal nail. In one post hole in one of the buildings that we've excavated at the site, not only do we find the post mold itself, the remnant of the post, but clay packed in and a fragment of iron from a jackplate armor piece wedged into the fill of that post hole. When Native Americans built houses, they rammed the posts straight into the ground. So the post holes that we see archaeologically are the same diameter as the posts themselves. We think that this represents a more Spanish colonial practice of digging a large hole with a shovel, which we knew the Spaniards had from written accounts, and then putting a post in and packing clay around it. So indications of Spanish presence and even participation in constructing and maintaining these buildings. In the same building with this post, with the iron fragment in the post hole, we found the rusted remnants of a steelyard scale, perhaps suspended in the rafters of the building, utilized probably for weighing provisions, or even samples of rock in the search for gemstones and metal ores. Never found much in the way of metal, although there is gold in North Carolina that they came close to but never found. But they did, in fact, bring back rock in search of gemstones, including quartz crystal, which we have found examples of at the site as shown here. There's the steelyard scale in place. It's just rust. It's really not even any of the iron that's left there. Other Spanish artifacts that I'll flip through fairly quickly here include wrought iron nails, many of which show signs of having been bent and reused for as long as they could make use of them. In the colonial frontier, there were not ready supplies of them. Similarly, we find evidence of whole, but also fragments of lead shot, presumably related to cutting pieces of lead to make the most of what was available. We have found one iron crossbow bolt tip. A school group that happened to be visiting the site one day was quite excited when this was found in in screening dirt that particular day. We've also found one tip from what we identify, an iron piece that we identified as a scabbard tip associated with more likely a dagger, maybe a sword. We have found several fragments of chain mail armor, an artifact in the palm of a hand here from the Berry site, and a very similar one from the site of Santa Elena on the South Carolina coast. That's either a clothing fastener or a sword hanging device to suspend a sword hilt on a belt. Some Spanish pottery representing different types whose date ranges kind of center on the mid-16th century, including olive jar fragments, but also Capara blue, Mayolica, and some other forms of Mayolica that we've found at the site. Not a huge number, but some examples of glass beads, including a temporally diagnostic type known as a Nueva Cadiz bead. And then copper alloy fragments, some of which are lacing tips or aglets. We've found some copper bell fragments. We think that's what they are, as well as items made out of copper alloy shaped by Native Americans into ornamental items of various kinds. Lastly, in terms of artifacts here, I wanted to mention a piece of soapstone. There's a soft material that outcrops in this region of North Carolina. Technically, it's steatite, more colloquially known as soapstone. Easy to carve, even with stone tools, but even easier with metal tools. And Native Americans carved all kinds of pipes and pendants out of this material. But Spaniards may well have done their own carving, and we have some soapstone fragments that we think may have been cut and drilled with metal tools. Back though to the site itself and how we currently make sense of some of the patterns we see in the architectural dialogue in the construction of houses in the fort and then ultimately the mound. South of the domestic compound and the mound are remnants of the fort, which we first recognized in doing excavations, and there were deposits there that didn't make sense until we exposed more and more area. We've really emphasized a strategy of horizontal exposure with targeted vertical excavations for stratigraphic information. As we go along, we need more vertical control and more stratigraphic excavations in the next few field seasons. We have excavated a couple trenches across the moat, or the feature we identify as the moat. We keep expecting to find remnants of a log stockade inside the fort, inside the moat, and we have found a few posts like the one shown here, but that's a bit of a mystery. The stratigraphic profile of the moat itself, as shown here, indicates that soon after the moat was excavated, like in 1566 or 1567, deposits slumped in.
Dr. Rodney?
Yep.
I'm going to have to cut you off, unfortunately, if you have a concluding slide or concluding statement, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience.
So the fort itself, as known from various forms of geophysical survey, including soil resistivity and ground penetrating radar, is outlined here. We have excavated this portion in the lower left, but this represents the moat surrounding the fort. And we think that the fort displaced Native American buildings that were present at this part of the landscape, and then was replaced after the fort was destroyed and abandoned by a series of structures like structure 6, maybe these other domestic structures over here, and an earthen mound that may have been constructed or enlarged, if it was present at first, as part of an effort to reclaim this as a Native American space. And I will wrap it up there and bring up a slide that may prompt some discussion. Thank you.